Chapter 41. I never saw it coming. And I can't believe it happened like this, Chester said, sipping on a steaming mug of soup Jane had made for him, shaking his head sadly. He and Angela had both taken a bath and put on some clean clothes. Because of their extensive first aid knowledge, the family had known that giving famished people too much food after a period of starvation could actually end up being lethal, but had explained that this was why they would only be having soup for dinner. "We had a holiday cabin around 30 miles from here," Angela said. "I know it's 30 miles now that you've told us exactly where we are. We used to come out here in the summer and the fall. In spring, we'd go down to our condo in Florida, and we'd have our 2 or 3 overseas vacations, too. Italy, France, Thailand, Switzerland, Japan. Oh, how I miss our traveling." "I always thought I had us set up for life," Chester murmured. He had told the family he was only 43 years old, but he looked closer to 60, as did Angela, who claimed to be the same age. The last few months had clearly taken a tremendous toll on their health. "I had so many investments, a diversified portfolio, extensive savings, 5 properties, and all of that turned out to be was an illusion, make-believe, all that money in the bank, and those stocks, all those property titles, numbers and a computer game. And when this EDM thing, EMP, Lance corrected gently. Yeah, when this EMP thing hit, it just wiped it out. Wiped it all out, like some godlike freaking toddler in the sky throwing a tantrum and hitting the reset button on civilization. All of my savings and investments, all my plans for the future, worth nothing. Zero, zip, nada, in the blink of an eye. He trailed off, a vacant stare in his eyes. "You and millions of others," Lance said softly, "if that's much of a consolation." "You know, we used to laugh at people like you," Angela admitted. "We used to joke about the tinfoil hat brigade and batship preppers and stuff like that, thinking our futures were so damn secure with all those numbers and computers, all that virtual crap we thought was so real. But now? Now who's laughing, huh?" "None of us feel good or right about being right about what happened," Lance said gently. "I'd much rather have been wrong about everything if it meant all this violence, suffering, and misery could have been avoided. Believe me, I wanted to be wrong about it. I prayed so desperately that my suspicions would turn out to be wrong, that I'd turn out to be crazy, and that everything would have just continued like it always had. But deep down, I knew that we'd reached a breaking point. Hell, I'd known that since the late 90s. Took a while to convince these two," he said, nodding first at Jane and then at Paul. "But I'm glad I eventually did, and I wish I could have convinced more people like you two about the truth of what was eventually going to happen. Maybe then you could have invested your future in land, seeds, permaculture, weapons, and fuel stores like we did, instead of an imaginary pension, investments, and stock market stuff." "Yeah," Chester murmured. "I wish I'd listened to people like you, instead of mocking you. But here we are, in the kind of hell I'd only imagined could ever exist in movies and video games." "It's not hell for us," Alan said, before Jane shot him an angry look, telling him that this was definitely not the right time for comments like that. He blushed embarrassedly and clammed up. "So, would you mind telling us more about the people who committed the acts of violence you told us about?" Lance asked. "They weren't Puerto Rican gangsters, were they?" Angela and Chester looked surprised when Lance said this. "A few of them actually were Puerto Rican or Latinos," Chester said. "But most significantly, their leader definitely was. He was one of the most evil-looking people I've ever seen in my life. The party of refugees we were with, I've told you what he and his men did to them. I still can't believe Angela and I managed to escape with our lives." You didn't hear any of these thugs calling their leader El Diablo, did you? Paul asked. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what they called him, Chester said. El Diablo. I won't forget that name, or that horrible face, for as long as I live. And if I never see that monster again, it'll be too soon. They talked a while longer about El Diablo's massacre of the party of refugees, a different atrocity to the one Paul had discovered. But it soon became clear that Angela and Chester were too traumatized by the events to remember any significant details. The most important detail was simply the fact that El Diablo was in the area. And worse was that he had a large party of armed killers with him. Anything from 15 to 20 men, according to what Chester and Angela reported. The thugs had been armed with assault rifles, pistols, shotguns, and grenades, and had been driving military Humvees from what they could remember. Neither Angela nor Chester knew much about guns or vehicles, so they couldn't give the family any more detailed information about the weaponry or cars. They seemed to remember, however, that there were only 2 Humvees. "That's 2 Humvees too many," Paul muttered when they said this. It was getting late, and Chester and Angela were too exhausted to talk any further. Lance got Alan, Kevin, and Gina to take them to Paul's blacksmith workshop, attached to the barn, and get a fire and sleeping places set up. While they were gone, he, Paul, and Jane talked about what to do with regard to the El Diablo situation. "At first light tomorrow, we have to get a whole lot more tripwires connected to M80s and flares set up. We can go as deep into the woods as a mile all around to have word of their approach very early. I'm sure a few will get triggered by deer and other critters, but better a false alarm than no alarm at all. As for protection closer to home, we have to get our sentries watching the perimeter 24/7, Lance said. The bottom line is, we cannot let them take us by surprise. Amen to that, brother, Paul said. It's just a pity we don't have more people. There are a number of places those bastards could approach us from, positions of good cover for them, and we've only got 5 people here. It's not as if everyone could be on guard duty all the time. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Lance said. With everything that needs doing around here, we'll be lucky if we can spare 1 sentry for a patrol. That leaves a lot of openings for El Diablo and his boys to launch an attack. We could have 2 extra people on watch, Jane said. Lance knew right away what she was suggesting, and he wasn't sure he liked the idea. 2 more sentries mean 2 more mouths to feed, honey, he said. I know we've planned well for the winter months, and we should have a lot to spare, but with extra mouths here, that lot to spare quickly becomes only a little to spare. And besides, what do Chester and Angela know about life in a place like this? Neither of them has even touched a gun before, let alone shot one. They're pure city slickers. They don't know the first thing about raising crops, tending land. They've survived this far, Jane countered. They must have learned something along the way. They've got eyes and ears that work, even if they don't work too well, Paul said. He was leaning toward agreeing with Jane. And for a few days, perhaps even a few weeks, they're going to be too weak to do anything much but sit around and eat maybe 2 small meals a day. If they could sit out in the woods and keep their eyes open, it would give us a tremendous security boost. They wouldn't need to have to shoot or fight or anything. Just being able to raise the alarm soon enough that El Diablo and his boys can't take us by surprise would give us enough of an edge to survive the battle instead of getting massacred. Lance was reluctant to take on more residents, but he realized that Paul and Jane were right. They were thin enough on manpower already, and with the imminent threat of El Diablo and his men, they needed all the sentries they could get. All right, Lance said. I'll speak to them in the morning. When this El Diablo thing is over, though, they're going to have to earn their keep by working the land like the rest of us. I don't care how rich and high and mighty Chester was before. His world of investment banks, international business travel, and hedge funds are dead now, and he's just another mouth to feed now. After everything he and his wife have been through, honey, I'm sure he understands that very clearly, Jane said. They'll do whatever we ask them to in order to be allowed to stay here, Paul said. And after suffering through starvation and deprivation and wandering the freezing wilderness for months, I think they'll be immensely thankful for whatever humble food and shelter we give them. Like I said, I'll speak to them in the morning, Lance said. As for now, though, we'd better organize sentry shifts and duties. Lance, Kevin, and Paul rotated sentry shifts throughout the night. It wasn't ideal, and each of them faced a cold, scary, and challenging shift alone in the freezing woods. The night passed silently and without incident, though, and when gray, cold dawn eventually broke, there was, fortunately, no sign of El Diablo and his men. Lance talked to Chester and Angela, inviting them to stay on the homestead, as long as they were willing to put in long hours on sentry duty. Both wept tears of joy and relief at the fact that they weren't being turned out into the wilderness, and they each enthusiastically promised to do whatever they were told to, the best to their abilities. Days passed, and then a week or two passed without incident. The two newcomers grew steadily stronger and healthier, and when they were strong and fit enough for it, Lance showed them the basics of shooting guns and gave each of them a simple .38 special revolver to keep with them on their sentry patrols. Everyone was becoming more hopeful and less wary, and everyone was hoping that the threat of El Diablo had passed. It seemed for a while almost as if it had, until the afternoon the weeping, terrified girl with a live grenade in her mouth showed up. Chapter 42. It was a sunny but bracingly chilly December afternoon, a few days before Christmas, and a light snowfall in the morning had dusted the ground and trees with a thin coverage of snow. Chester had been patrolling the woods all afternoon and had just sat down on the fold-up chair he carried around with him. He was still too weak to walk or stand for long periods when he saw the girl. At first he thought he saw things. In the days before, he and his wife had stumbled across the homestead during the period of intense starvation and woe they had suffered through. He had often experienced hallucinations due to stress and lack of nutrients. Thus, when he saw a young adolescent girl, dressed in rags, come out of the wood's depths, walking barefoot through the snow, he was initially convinced he was seeing things. He closed his eyes, held them shut for a few seconds, and then opened them again. This usually caused the hallucinations to vanish. The girl was still there, though, staggering and stumbling toward him, with her hands behind her back and her face contorted with sheer terror. She was a pale, thin girl of perhaps 13 or 14 years, with a shock of messy red hair and big, piercing emerald eyes. She was holding something in her mouth. Chester couldn't make out what it was from the distance between them, perhaps 50 yards, but it looked like it was the size of an apple, but olive green in color. She didn't appear to be a threat at all, but Lance and Paul had drilled into the new arrivals that any human presence, threatening or not, was to be reported immediately. In urgent cases, such as men with weapons arriving, the procedure was to fire 3 shots into the air. In less urgent matters, though, so as not to waste ammunition, the procedure was to fire a large bottle rocket into the air. Chester hastily pulled the makeshift missile out of his belt, jabbed the stick into the hard ground, and lit the fuse, nervously alternating his gaze between the stumbling girl and the hissing fuse as it burned up. Soon enough, the rocket streaked into the sky with a shriek and exploded in a loud boom of bright colors. Now that Chester had sounded the alarm, he turned his attention to the girl. "Hold on there, Missy. Stay right where you are," he said, raising his .38 special and pointing it at her. He felt terrible pointing a firearm at a child. Still, Lance had drilled it into him and his wife that any human being, no matter how innocuous they appeared to be, was to be treated as a dangerous threat until proven otherwise. The girl said nothing. She couldn't, because of the object in her mouth, but she kept coming forward, staggering and stumbling on weak, skinny legs. "Missy, you need to stop, okay?" Chester said nervously. "Please, just stay there for a minute until my friends get there. I don't want to have to... Look, please stop. Please, don't come any closer. Chester heard footsteps running up behind him. And when he looked over his shoulder and saw Lance running through the trees, a flood of relief washed through him. "Thank God you're here, Lance," he said. "I don't know who she is or where she's come from, but she won't listen to me." Lance stopped near Chester and raised his AR-15, aiming it at the girl. "Whoa, hold up there, girl," he said, his aggressive bark far more intimidating than Chester's meek pleas. "Stop where you are." The girl kept coming forward, though. Lance muttered a curse under his breath and peered through his scope to get a clearer view of her. When he did, though, he gasped with shock. The object in her mouth was a hand grenade, and she was biting down on the trigger mechanism. The hand grenade was tied around her neck by some string, so even if she tried to spit it out, it would still be on her body when it blew up. Her hands were tied behind her back. Also, there was a handwritten note pinned to her dress, and Lance was quite sure he knew who had written the note and who had done this to the girl. "Oh, shit," he muttered. "This is not good. This is not good at all." "What's wrong with her?" Chester asked. "What's in her mouth?" "It's a hand grenade, and if she spits it out, it'll blow in a few seconds," Lance answered. "Oh my God," Chester murmured. "What are we going to do?" "Keep your eyes on the woods. Make sure this isn't a setup for an ambush or anything," Lance said. "I'll take care of the girl." Just then, Jane and Paul came running through the trees, their weapons at the ready. "What's going on here?" Paul asked. "Keep your eyes on the woods. There might be an attack coming," Lance said. "I'm going to deal with the girl." He lowered his rifle and walked slowly over to the girl, keeping his eyes locked with hers as he approached her. "Listen, kid," he said in a calm, soothing voice. "It's going to be all right. Stay still. I'll help you out. I'm going to help you, okay? Just keep biting down. Don't let it fall out of your mouth. I'm going to make sure you're okay. I'm going to take care of this. I just need you to do exactly what I say, okay?" With tears streaming down her wan cheeks and her eyes wide with pure terror, the girl nodded. Lance let his rifle hang from its shoulder strap as he got closer to her. He wouldn't need it now. What he would be needing, though, were nerves of steel and steady hands. The girl stood stock still as Lance walked up to her. "Okay, I'm going to get this out now, all right?" he said. "I need you to trust me. First, I have to cut the string so that I can toss the grenade as soon as I pulled it out of your mouth. I'm going to do that now. That's why I'm taking my knife out. I'm not going to harm you, so just be cool, okay?" The girl nodded. Lance pulled his hunting knife out of his sheath and cut through the string around the girl's neck. "All right, now I'm going to pull out the grenade," he said. "So I have to reach into your mouth. It will be a little uncomfortable, but I have to get my fingers around the trigger mechanism. Just let me do that, okay? And don't fight it." Again, the tearful girl nodded. Lance knew that the next few seconds would determine whether he and the girl lived or died, and that he needed to work deftly and decisively. Her mouth was already stretched open as wide as it would go to accommodate the grenade, and he imagined that she was in a great deal of pain, and her jaw and teeth had to be in agony. Nonetheless, he would have to hurt her a little more in order to safely extract the grenade and avoid blowing both of them up. "I'm sorry," he said, as he prepared to do what he needed to be done. "This will hurt for a few seconds." He shoved his fingertips into her mouth, pressed down on the trigger mechanism. The girl squealed with pain as he stretched her jaw almost to dislocation point. But the moment he managed to get a grip on the grenade, he pulled it out. The girl let out a cry of relief, and Lance hurled the grenade as far as he could. It sailed through the treetops, bounced a few times, and then exploded. As soon as the girl was safe, Jane, with her motherly instincts kicking into overdrive, came running over to her. While Jane hugged and consoled the terrified girl, Lance unpinned the note from her ragged jacket and started reading it. It was from El Diablo, and the message was laid out with chilling clarity. Hand over Jane, and he promised to leave everyone else in peace. If these terms were not met, everyone on the homestead would be slaughtered. Chapter 43. The note says he and his men will be here tomorrow at noon, Lance said grimly. Everyone was seated around the dining table in the main cabin, except the girl, who was resting and recovering after her ordeal, and Chester and Angela, who were on sentry duty outdoors. "We can't trust anything that Viper says," Paul said, his fist clenched. "His whole deal might just be a ploy to set up an earlier attack and take us by surprise while we're setting up our defenses. Hell, he might even attack tonight." "Yeah, man, that's what I was thinking," Lance said. "There's no way he's going to let us be, even if we did the unthinkable and handed over my wife, which would never happen, not in a million years. He and his cowardly thugs are going to attack us, whatever happens. And the only real question is whether he does it when he says he will, or whether he and his men launch their assault much earlier. If they're going to use the Humvees in their attack, which I'm damn sure they will," Paul said, "they'd have to attack during daylight hours. El Diablo is a psycho, but he's no idiot. And he'll know that his vehicle's headlamps will make them sitting ducks in the darkness. We'll be able to pour fire into them from hundreds of yards away if they try and approach via the only road through the trees. He knows his men will walk into a lot more traps in the darkness than they would during daylight hours. He's got more men than we do, but he doesn't have an infinite supply, and he surely knows that even if he lost a few to our traps, it could swing the outcome of the battle." "I remember dealing with him in court, back when I put him in prison," Jane said. "He's very, very cunning and smart. He's going to use every trick in the book to make sure he has the upper hand in this encounter." "There is one thing we can use against him, though," Lance said. "His desire to get vengeance against you, honey. He might be intelligent, but there's nothing like blind hatred to override logic and common sense." "I have an idea how we can exploit that," Ellen said. Everyone turned and stared at him with surprise. Nobody had expected the youngest member of the household to come up with an idea about how best to defend the homestead in the coming battle. "You guys have all seen the Santa Claus I've been making with scrap materials. We can use him." Alan, you do realize that this is no game, right?" Paul asked slowly, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "You understand that we're talking about a matter of life and death here, don't you?" "I understand that perfectly well, Uncle Paul," Alan said confidently. "Trust me, I think this will work." He went on to explain exactly how he intended to use the large wooden Santa Claus he'd been building. As he did, smiles began to break across everyone's faces, especially those of Lance and Jane, who were immensely proud of their son's ingenuity and ability to think creatively. "Well, I'll be damned," Paul said, grinning. "That just might work. If El Diablo is blinded enough by his hatred of Jane, that Santa Claus of yours could lead him into a deadly trap." "We have to try," Lance said. "If Alan's plan works, it'll strike a devastating blow against El Diablo's men." The smile fell from Paul's face. "Even if it does work, though," he said, his tone grim, "it will only take out a couple of them, and we'd still be outnumbered. We've got 2 trained soldiers here. Kevin, who can shoot well, and Jane, who's a fine shot." "I can shoot too, Uncle Paul," Alan insisted. "I know you can," Paul said gently. "And I never meant to suggest otherwise. It's just that you haven't shot at someone who's firing right back at you and trying to kill you. Everyone else I mentioned has done that, but you're a good, solid shooter, Alan, and I know you can protect this land with the best of us. Then we've got Gina, who's become a decent shot since she arrived here." He continued, giving Gina, who blushed, a respectful nod. "But the new arrivals, sure. They've finally learned to shoot straight with those revolvers we gave them, but that's at paper targets with 0 stress. I don't think either of them is going to be of any use in a firefight. So that just leaves the 6 of us against 20 of El Diablo's hardened killers. Maybe 14 or 15 of them if Alan's plan works," Lance said. Maybe, but even then, we're still outnumbered by more than 2-1, Paul countered. At this point, an idea popped into Lance's head. Chester and Angela don't have to fire a single shot to be useful in the battle, he said, furrowing his brow and scratching his chin. If you're not shooting in a firefight, you're not exactly useful, Paul countered, still not convinced that the weak new arrivals could be of any use. Look, one of El Diablo's biggest advantages is the fact that he's got 2 military Humvees, Lance said. But remember, we've got the Defender and a military Humvee, too. And you're proposing that we hand our valuable vehicles over to those two? Paul scoffed. Lance, you're my best friend and my brother from another mother, so I say this with only the best intentions and love in my heart. But have you lost your mind, man? Lance chuckled and flashed his friend a shit-eating grin. When I explain what I intend to achieve by getting Chester and Angela to drive one of our vehicles, buddy, you're going to understand that my head is screwed on just fine. Lance laid out his plan to Paul, and when the details and aims of it became clear, any semblance of doubt vanished from Paul's mind. Now he understood precisely how valuable the new arrivals could be. Oh, now I get it, he said, nodding with satisfaction. If those two can pull it off, we can totally flip the tables on El Diablo. With all these things we're going to have to prepare, Jane said. It looks like we're all going to be up all night getting things set up and doing some hard physical labor. I'll brew some strong coffee to wake us all up. I want to check on the newest arrival and see how she's doing after that terrible experience she went through. Jane went and spoke to the girl, Eleanor. It turned out she was 14 years old, and that she had been captured by El Diablo's men a week prior. Like many people who now wandered the wilderness in a pitiful condition, she was a refugee from the city. She described how disease had exploded through the city's population following the massive tropical storm that arrived 2 days after Halloween. Her family had all contracted the disease, which sounded like dysentery to Jane, judging by the symptoms Eleanor described, and had all perished. Eleanor had survived alone in the city for over a month, raiding the apartments of those who had died from some disease and subsisting on whatever canned food, cookies, juice, or soda she could find. She had been an enthusiastic rock climber in the pre-EMP days and had put her climbing skills to good use, scaling the sides of apartment buildings to get up to the top floors and breaking into people's apartments via their balconies. In this manner, she had been able to gain access to apartments that were out of bounds to other raiders and looters. Eventually, though, she and the other survivors had exhausted the supply of food and drink in the city, and she, like so many others, had had to set off on a long trek inland, into the hills and woods, not knowing where they were going or how they were going to survive. When she left the city, she told Jane that rival gangs had turned it into a horrifying war zone. The currencies the armed men traded in were simple: canned and dehydrated food supplies, bottled water, and, disturbingly, women, especially young, attractive ones. You're lucky you got out before those people captured you, sweetie, Jane said. I thought so too, until those animals caught me in the woods, Eleanor murmured. That El Diablo guy, he's terrifying. Scarier even than the warlords in the city. He and his men had taken some other captives, and they did bad things to those people. When they tied me up and took me out into the woods and pinned that note to my coat, put that grenade in my mouth and told me to walk in a straight line as far as I could, I thought I was dead for sure. I'm really happy that you and your husband saved me. Did El Diablo tell you anything about us? Jane asked. Eleanor shook her head. He only said that if I saw you guys, I had to keep walking toward you or they'd shoot me in the back. He said if I turned around or tried to look behind me, they'd kill me. Eleanor told Jane a few more things about what El Diablo and his men had done to her, and the horror and brutality of what these men had done to the girl and other captives made Jane's blood boil. She had known, of course, how monstrous and psychotic a man El Diablo was, back when she'd put him in prison, supposedly for life. Now she was even more horrified and disgusted by the gang leader and his associates than she had ever thought possible. She gave Eleanor a long hug, stroking the girl's hair and speaking soothing words to her, and allowed the girl to weep and let out all the bottled-up trauma she'd been carrying around with her all this time. And when Eleanor finally laid down and fell asleep, Jane curled her hands into tight fists, with righteous anger burning and bubbling and hissing inside her. "I'm gonna make sure El Diablo is brought to justice," she whispered determinedly. "But this time, he's getting a death sentence." Chapter 44. "Do you really think they'll stick around and try to fight?" asked Hugo, one of El Diablo's towering bodyguards. The lack of quality nutrition meant that he, like his twin brother Alonzo, had slimmed down since the night the EMP had struck, but both of them were still massively strong. "I think they're already running as fast as their little legs will take them," Alonzo said, chuckling. "When they saw Grenade Girl coming, they must have shit their pants. You know they stuck around after that, and after finding the message that we carved into those motherfuckers' foreheads? They'd be the stupidest sons of bitches on the planet if they tried to hang out and fight us." El Diablo shook his head, scowling. "Don't underestimate the Buddha and her family," he growled. "Those two men, even the older boy, they're tough motherfuckers." "What about those two scrawny old weasels they've got on guard duty?" Alonzo scoffed. "I could kill both of those weak little pricks with one punch. Yeah, they got guns, but you just have to fucking fart loudly in their direction and they'll drop the pieces and run without firing a single shot." El Diablo spun around, his eyes glowing with sudden intense fury, and his jaw clenched, and he grabbed Alonzo's ragged collar and got his face right up in the big man's. "Shut the fuck up, you ignorant piece of shit," he hissed. "I'll cut your fucking liver out and eat it in front of you if you keep fucking around like this. Do not underestimate these people. I want that puta alive, but I don't want to lose half my men taking her. Do you understand me, you fucking moron? And if you underestimate them, then I guarantee we will lose more than half my boys. And if that happens, I'll do worse things to you than I would have done to her, hombre. I promise you that." "Okay, man, okay," Alonzo said slowly, avoiding eye contact with his furious boss. "I'm sorry, man. I won't do it again." El Diablo growled and shoved the big man away. "You better not, motherfucker. Now let's get the boys together. We attack at first light, and you idiots better do it the exact way I tell you to." El Diablo had divided his 20 men up into 4 groups. 2 would lead the initial assault in the military Humvees, which El Diablo expected would be met with stiff resistance. If the homesteaders decided to stand their ground and fight rather than fleeing before the commencement of the fight. After that, he, Alonzo, and Hugo would each lead a team of 3 fighters on foot, striking from 3 different directions simultaneously. El Diablo hoped that his initial assault with his troops in the Humvees would kill the men of the Homestead, who would surely be fighting in the front lines, and allow him, Alonzo, and Hugo to mop up the survivors and capture the prizes, Jane, and hopefully the attractive teenage girl who lived with the Homesteaders, alive. El Diablo was no fool, and he expected some traps and trickery on the part of the Homesteaders. Hopefully, though, the armored Humvees would bear the brunt of whatever traps the Homesteaders had set up. He knew from his own experience battling U.S. Army troops that the vehicles could take a tremendous beating from all sorts of weapons and explosives and still protect the men inside. Even so, he wasn't about to take any chances by being inside one of the vehicles himself. He had more foolish men to take on those roles. There was only one road through the dense woods to the homestead, and El Diablo knew that the homesteaders would have set traps for his Humvees along this road. The only questions were, what these traps were and how many of them had been set up. He and his men set out from their camp an hour before dawn, all crammed into the 2 Humvees, with some men having to hang on the sides and sit on the vehicle's roofs. When they got within 2 miles of the homestead, shortly before first light, El Diablo, Hugo, and Alonzo would take their teams on foot from that point on. They rumbled through the dark forest in somber silence. A few of the men cracked jokes once in a while, but El Diablo cussed them out angrily. This was no game, and if the prize was lost, he intended to show the men who failed him the true meaning of pain, and each of them knew this. None wanted to be on the receiving end of El Diablo's wrath. It would be a far more desirable fate to take a bullet from the homesteaders and meet a quick end, rather than be subjected to whatever horrendous, drawn-out torture El Diablo would dole out in the event of failure. They reached a spot around 2 miles from the camp, and it was at this point that El Diablo, Alonzo, Hugo, and their respective squads of soldiers departed the vehicles. El Diablo emphasized to the drivers and the troops remaining in the Humvees that they were to strike hard and fight with vicious aggression, but not to be unnecessarily hasty, and to keep their eyes open for traps and acts of deception intended to draw them into traps. "All right, puta," Diablo whispered to the dark forest, which was slowly becoming lighter as dawn approached. "Now we settle this grudge. In a few hours, either you or I will be dead. Either way, we end this today." Then he turned to his men, as well as Hugo and Alonzo's. "Kill them," he growled. "Gut them like the pigs they are. Rape the women, rip the men's guts out while they're still alive, and strangle the fucks with their entrails. Go now! Kill them all!" Chapter 45. The first trap to take out a Humvee was a simple but brutally effective one. The men hadn't had enough time or energy to dig a pit that would be deep enough to trap and incapacitate a Humvee, but they had managed to dig one a few feet deep. The rugged vehicle would be able to get out of the pit with a little assistance, but for what Lance intended to do, a minute stuck in the ditch was all that was needed to take out the vehicle totally, and hopefully the men in it too. He and Paul were waiting by the hole in the darkness of the pre-dawn, and as the sky began to lighten, they saw 2 pairs of headlights stabbing through the black labyrinth of trees in the distance, and knew their enemies were approaching. "Time to put the final touches on this little tiger trap," Lance said. "Fill it up." They had covered most of the pit over with branches and leaves to disguise it, so that the Humvee would drive right over, and then into it. Too late to see it. But they'd left one corner uncovered, and now that they saw their enemies approaching, they tipped over the barrels they'd carted up here with the defender and emptied the contents. Then they covered up the corner, and Paul drove off in the defender, leaving Lance on his own. Lance ran over to the spot behind a tree, where he'd have a clear shot at his target, and then he waited. He watched in grim silence as the 2 Humvees approached. They were driving slowly up the winding, bumpy track through the woods, and were obviously on the lookout for an ambush. They would walk right into this one, though. He was sure of it. He waited in suspense as the first Humvee rolled closer and closer to the pit, wondering if they would be able to tell that the covering was not solid road, but a mere flimsy latticework of branches and leaves, and praying that they wouldn't make it out. The Humvee rolled closer and closer to the trap, and Lance could barely handle the mounting tension. If they realized a trap had been set in the road and stopped, his plan for defending the homestead would be greatly weakened. They did not stop. The Humvee crashed through the latticework of branches and leaves, and the vehicle plunged into the ditch they'd created. With a bit of skilled driving, the driver could get the vehicle out of the pit in short order, but a few moments were all Lance needed. He had lined up the target he needed to hit, a small piece of steel, just inside the pit, and he squeezed the trigger, just after the Humvee plunged in. The round he fired was a full metal jacket one, and when it hit the steel lump, it threw off a shower of sparks, which ignited the many gallons of gasoline Lance and Paul had just poured into the pit. A gargantuan fireball burst like an exploding firework up from the ground, swallowing the trapped Humvee whole and consuming it with roaring flames. The other Humvee skidded to a halt behind it, and the men jumped out, hoping to save their companions who were scrambling out of the burning vehicle. Flames engulfed each of them as they tried to escape, and human torches were soon running around the woods, screaming as they died. Lance did not see this, though, as he had already taken off at a run the moment the fireball had exploded. He had to now move on to the next phase of the plan. He raced through the woods at a full sprint, tearing up the road at speed. Behind him, the second Humvee's occupants had already realized that their burning companions were beyond saving. The men inside were now filled with a rage-fueled desire for revenge and racing up the road. Chester and Angela were waiting near the cabins in the Land Rover Defender, with the motor running. Each of them was a bundle of nerves, but they were determined to do their best and play their part in defending the homestead that had saved their lives. With them in the Defender were several piles of clothes, hats, and stacked footballs, soccer balls, pots and pans, all of which Alan, Gina, and Eleanor had dressed up to look like people sitting in the vehicle. In the dim gray light of the breaking dawn, unless you were right up next to the Defender, it looked as if it were full of people. In the rearview mirror, Chester saw Lance come running down the road, swinging his left arm in a circular motion, and that was the signal he had been waiting for. He switched on the Defender's lights, his sign to Lance that he had seen and acknowledged his swinging left arm. And at this point, Lance, knowing that Chester was ready, veered off into the barn to get into position for the next phase of the plan. Now Chester waited with his trembling hands clammy on the steering wheel. He and Angela wouldn't be required to do any shooting, but that didn't make this any less nerve-wracking for either of them. He almost threw up when he saw the enemy Humvee come rolling down the road, and his first instinct was to stomp on the gas pedal the instant he caught sight of the Humvee. But Chester knew he had to wait and draw them in closer before luring them off to the next trap. The enemy Humvee quickly caught sight of the Defender, and the sight of the improvised dummies in the passenger seats was enough to convince El Diablo's men that the homesteaders were abandoning their home to flee. The driver punched the gas, while two passengers hung out the rear windows and opened fire on the Defender with their AK-47s. A couple of AK rounds peppering the back of the Defender was enough to convince Chester that he didn't need to hang around for a moment longer. He floored the accelerator and took off up the road that led up the hill behind the homestead, and the enemy Humvee and its occupants followed in eager pursuit. At that point, El Diablo, Alonzo, and Hugo and their men were getting close to the homestead's perimeter on foot. El Diablo had seen the Humvee go chasing after the Defender, and his men had cheered, believing that despite the loss of one SUV and its occupants, they had won the battle. But El Diablo was not convinced. The wily Puta and her men would not flee so readily, he believed. The three groups paused to survey the scene in detail from the cover of the trees. They had learned enough from raiding over the past few months not to go charging blindly anywhere, even places that seemed deserted. Alonzo and his team were closest to the main cabin, in which a lamp was burning. One of Alonzo's men had a hunting rifle. Alonzo took it and peered through the scope and saw the silhouette of a man with a gun in the cabin. He stuck his finger into his mouth and let out two piercing whistles, a signal to El Diablo that someone occupied the cabin. El Diablo let out a single loud whistle back, which was a go-ahead for Alonzo to attack. Alonzo lined up the silhouette's head in the crosshairs of his sights, grinned, and then squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the window shattered, the silhouette's head snapped back, and the man dropped to the floor. "Got you, motherfucker," Alonzo growled. He handed the rifle back to his man and then took up his AK-47. "If anyone else is hiding in that house, let's take those motherfuckers out," he roared to his men. They burst out of the trees, running low across the grass with their weapons shouldered and ready to fire. They were met with no opposition and reached the cabin's porch without a single shot fired. Alonzo sprayed a burst of fully automatic AK fire through the cabin's wooden door, just to be safe. Then, not wanting to risk his neck right away, he ordered one of his underlings to kick the door in. The man did this and charged in, and still, no shots were fired. "What the hell?" the man said, puzzled as he stormed into the cabin. "What's going on there, man?" Alonzo asked, running into the cabin, followed by his other two men. They saw that the man Alonzo had just shot with the hunting rifle was actually a life-sized Santa Claus mannequin, and the rifle he had been holding was merely a BB gun. Then, however, the men saw the real firearms, shotguns, mounted all around the room, aiming inwards, their triggers all connected to a single string that ran down the stairs into the cellar, where Alan was waiting with his hand curled around the end of the string. "Oh, shit!" Alonzo gasped, and the blood drained from his face. Alan yanked the string, and with a tremendous boom, all of the shotguns fired simultaneously, cutting Alonzo and his men down in a chaotic storm of spraying buckshot. Meanwhile, Paul and Kevin were hiding in the woods in an improvised bunker they had dug the night before, the entrance of which was concealed with leaves, branches, and twigs. They were uphill from the homestead, and each was ready with his AR-15 rifle. When they saw Hugo and his men walking through the woods, preparing to attack the homestead from the right flank, they waited until the men were around 50 yards from them, and then they opened fire. Paul took out one of Hugo's men immediately with a headshot, but Kevin's first shot slammed into a man's bulletproof vest, knocking him over, but not seriously wounding him. Hugo and the other thug dropped to the ground and returned fire with their AKs, and soon bullets were flying from both sides in a fierce firefight. In the hills, the Humvee was catching up to the fleeing Land Rover Defender, which Chester was driving like a demon. He reached the point where the trap was to be sprung, a curved section of road that hugged the steep side of the hill and had an almost sheer drop into a deep gully lined with jagged rocks. Hiding in the bushes up the steep slope was Gina, in the military Humvee. She watched as Chester came careening around the treacherous bend in the Land Rover, and then she saw the Humvee come racing along in hot pursuit. She knew her timing had to be perfect. She waited as the Humvee, which hadn't seen her vehicle hidden behind the bushes just to the side of the road, came racing along, and then, when it got close, she dropped the parking brake and stomped on the gas. As the vehicle surged forward, she jumped out of the driver's door, which Paul and Lance had removed for this express purpose. Her timing wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. The Humvee came barreling out of the bushes and T-boned the enemy vehicle, hitting it with enough force and momentum to send it veering off the road and plunging into the deep gully. The Humvee tumbled, bouncing and rolling and smashing against the rocks until it finally came to rest at the bottom, smoking and wrecked. Nobody in the vehicle had survived the deadly plummet, and Gina, Chester, and Angela breathed out a sigh of relief. Their part in the battle was over. There was one final group of attackers to deal with, El Diablo and his 3 men. Lance and Jane intended to deal with them personally. The 2 of them were hiding in the barn's upper level, each with rifles, spare ammo, and handguns at the ready. "Line them up in your sights carefully, honey. Then take your shot," Lance whispered to Jane. "Make every round count." They watched as El Diablo and his men came out of the trees. The sound of firing from the other side of the homestead was intense, and Lance hoped that Paul and Kevin would be able to prevail against the other group of invaders. If they could just take these 4 men out quickly and quietly, it could be over with no loss of life on their side. "Here I am, you piece of shit!" Jane suddenly yelled, standing up and showing herself to El Diablo in the barn window. "Come and get me!" The moment she had laid eyes on El Diablo, her rage and hatred of the man had boiled over, and she hadn't been able to hold herself back or think logically. Pure emotion, raw and fierce, poured out of her in a torrent of intensity. This was the man who had tried to kidnap and torture her son, who had massacred scores of innocent people, who had molested Eleanor and shoved a grenade in her mouth. She couldn't just take him down quietly. She wanted him to know that she was here, and she was completely unafraid of him. However, Lance groaned with severe disappointment. For the moment his wife jumped up and started yelling, El Diablo and his men swung their weapons in the direction of the barn and opened fire. Lance was able to take 1 man out before a barrage of bullets ripped through the walls of the barn. "Quick, jump," Lance said. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. What have I done? What have I done?" Jane gasped, overcome with remorse for her foolish outburst. "Just jump, apologize later," Lance said, before leaping. They hadn't been able to get sandbags up here since this spot was supposed to be the one they were sniping from. But that plan had now gone out the window. There was straw below them for them to safely jump onto, and Lance landed on it and then scrambled out, running over to one of the barn windows to return fire at El Diablo and his men as they charged the building. Behind him, Jane jumped into the straw and then ran over to a couple of sandbags to take cover. El Diablo yelled to his men as he charged the barn, firing his AK-47 at the window Lance had been shooting from. "The grenades! Get the fucking grenades in there!" Lance, who was reloading behind cover, when he heard that command, popped his head and rifle up to fire. But 2 grenades were already flying through the air. He cut down one of the men, but the guy had already tossed the grenades, and he watched in horror as they came hurtling through the upper windows of the barn, and saw where their trajectory was taking them. The instant he realized where the grenades would land, only one thought flashed through his mind. He had to save Jane's life. He threw his rifle aside and sprinted at superhuman speed across the barn floor, and then dove over the sandbags, landing on top of his wife and smothering her body with his, just as the 2 grenades exploded mere yards from the 2 of them. Jane felt a tremendous force rock every inch of her body, and it felt as if a dozen sledgehammers were all smashing her at once. She was dazed and almost knocked out, but somehow retained consciousness. On top of her, though, Lance's body was limp and still, deathly still, and he wasn't breathing. "No!" she screamed. She didn't have time to panic, though, for El Diablo and his remaining man came charging into the barn. He saw, through the smoke from the grenades, that Jane was trapped under her husband's body, and he lowered his weapon and smiled. "I waited a long time for this, puta," he growled as he sauntered toward her, with his grinning sidekick in tow. "I've waited a long, long time for this." Jane gasped and struggled, trying to get to her firearm, but Lance's body had her pinned down tight. El Diablo's sidekick came and kicked her in the jaw, stunning her further, and then hauled Lance's body off her and kicked her firearms away, leaving her unarmed. Then El Diablo came and squatted down next to her. He set his AK-47 onto the floor and pulled out a long, razor-sharp knife, and then smiled and caressed her cheek softly. He traced the edge of the blade along her forehead and then down the side of her face. "Before the end of today, puta," he whispered, You're gonna see me wearing this face of yours, and your whole fucking skin like a Halloween costume. I'm gonna skin you nice and slow. Make sure you stay alive until I've got every inch of skin off you." Jane tried to struggle, but her limbs simply wouldn't respond. The concussive effect of the grenade had left her heavily dazed and disoriented. El Diablo grabbed a fistful of her hair and pulled her face toward his. "You stole 12 years of my life, puta," he snarled, his eyes blazing with fury and hatred. "I'm gonna make you pay for each and every one of those years you took from me. Before I start skinning you like a dead fucking deer, I'm gonna take one body part for each year you stole from me. Should I start with your nose, an ear, maybe a finger? Perhaps I'll start small and cut your nipples off, huh? Yeah, let's start with that," he growled. And he started to stick his hand down her shirt. That was when a gunshot rang out. El Diablo's sidekick gasped and stumbled backward, and then another gunshot rang out, and the man dropped dead. El Diablo dropped his knife, whipped out his pistol, and sprang to his feet. But another gunshot crashed through the barn. The bullet took him in the stomach, and he gasped as he staggered back. Still he tried to raise his gun to fire, but 2 more shots rang out, and they punched him to the ground, and the pistol clattered away. Suddenly, fierce strength returned to Jane's limbs. She snatched up the knife El Diablo had dropped, and she pounced on his prone form, her eyes wild with a mad fury. He looked up at her, grinning mockingly, blood frothing at the sides of his mouth, defiant and vicious, even as he was dying. "It's over, you sick, psychotic monster," she snarled. "It's over, and I win." Then she slammed the knife into his chest, burying the blade to its hilt. And then she stabbed him again and again and again, slamming the blade into him over and over, continuing even after he was dead, until Kevin and Paul, who had shot El Diablo and his man, pulled Jane off of him. "It's over, Jane, it's over," Paul said gently. "Yes, it is," she sobbed softly. And then she crawled over to Lance's limp, bloody body and hugged it tightly and wept. Epilogue. It was as beautiful a spring day as any of them could remember. The sky was a rich blue, the trees were green, and the flowers were blooming, and the last of the winter chill had left the air. Alan had just finished working on giving the Land Rover Defender a service. The first time he had done such a thing on his own. He was not alone, though. Chester was with him, not to observe and teach the boy, but to learn how to do it. In all his years, he had never had to service a vehicle himself. The old Chester would have been embarrassed about his ignorance of such things, but the new Chester was a humble man who was eager to learn about the things he had always taken for granted before. "You're all done, I think," Chester remarked. Alan gave a proud nod. "Yeah, I'm all done now. I just wish my dad could have been here to see me do this." Just then, Kevin walked into the barn with Gina. The two of them were inseparable these days, and it was rare to see one without the other. "You finished servicing the Defender, Al?" Kevin asked. "Your brother did an excellent job as far as I can tell," Chester said. "I'll be the judge of that," Kevin said, walking over to the vehicle and carefully inspecting its engine. "He was just saying how he wished his father was here to have seen him give the vehicle a servicing on his own," Chester said. "And I'll be the judge of how good a job he did," a new voice said. Everyone turned and looked at the new arrival, who came hobbling and limping into the barn, followed by Jane and Paul. "Dad!" Alan exclaimed, dropping his wrench and running over to hug his father. You and Paul weren't supposed to be back until next week." Lance winced as his son hugged him. He had barely survived the grenade blast, and parts of his body were still extremely sensitive, even months after the battle. His legs had taken a lot of shrapnel, and he had suffered a loss of mobility. But aside from that, he was now strong and healthy. Jane and Paul had given him emergency surgery to the best of their ability, and both of his sons had donated their blood to keep him alive in the difficult week after the battle. Against all odds, though, Lance had pulled through. "We made good time on the dirt bikes," Lance said, after disengaging from his hug with Alan. "We had to cut the mission short anyway because we didn't find any fuel in the abandoned town. But we did find some other useful things. Come on, I'll show you." "After lunch," Jane insisted, smiling. "I've got a Sunday roast all cooked up and ready. Come on, everyone, let's go eat." They all left the barn, smiling and laughing. Above them, the sun shone brightly, and beneath them, the earth slowly turned, as it always had and always will. The end.